Thomas Mayfield sat at his desk, the light from his monitor casting a pale glow across his tired features. At 53, he had become part of the furniture at Centrion Dynamics, an IT specialist with nearly 19 years behind him in the same chair, on the same floor, in the same building. His department lived in the shadows, invisible when everything ran smoothly, and the first to blame when it didn't. That was the nature of tech support. They kept the machine running, but no one ever stopped to thank the gears. Lately, the air in the office felt different. Not just the literal air, though even that seemed colder, more artificial, as if the HVAC system had been reprogrammed to match the emotional climate. The once familiar scent of plastic casings and heated circuit boards had been replaced by something sharper, a sterile, metallic undertone that reminded him of hospital corridors. It was the smell of something being quietly dismantled. The changes had started a few months ago with the arrival of external consultants. Their presence had been announced with generic enthusiasm, words like efficiency and streamlining tossed around like confetti in department-wide emails. But beneath the surface of corporate buzzwords, there was a quiet unease. These weren't just analysts or auditors. They were harbingers. The man behind the movement was Lance Hope, the newly appointed chief operating officer. Young, polished, always impeccably dressed, he looked like he'd stepped out of a tech magazine spread. His photo appeared more frequently on the internal network than the monthly financials. He was the face of change, always smiling, always holding a cup of coffee in his branded mug that somehow made him look both approachable and in control. He hosted webinars with forced warmth, sent out bulletins filled with empty encouragement, and spoke of culture evolution in the tone of someone reading a product description. At first, Thomas found it amusing. Then quietly, it became unsettling. Staff meetings grew shorter and colder. Familiar faces began to vanish without explanation. And while no one said it outright, the message hung heavy in the air. The company was being reshaped, and those who didn't fit the new mold were no longer part of the future. Thomas felt it in his bones, the way a man senses a storm long before the clouds appear. Something was coming, and he knew better than to ignore it. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Kevin, one of Thomas's colleagues, had been the first. There was no announcement, no farewell email. One day he was at his desk, and the next he wasn't. His login credentials failed without warning, and by the time he realized something was wrong, someone else was already sitting in his chair. His name vanished from the internal directory as if he had never existed. Then came Armand, then Jenny. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: sudden, quiet, clinical. No explanations were given, and no questions were asked. In the IT department, they understood the language of the system better than most. They noticed changes others didn't. Thomas began to watch more closely, tracking access logs, permissions, back-end modifications. Patterns emerged, and they weren't random. Administrative rights were being adjusted, user privileges quietly revoked. Folders that had always been open to senior engineers were now restricted. Someone from Human Resources, a name Thomas didn't recognize, had started accessing the software procurement database, a place no HR employee had ever touched before. It was as if someone were reprogramming the architecture of the company itself, reshaping the digital infrastructure with precise, surgical intent. New names populated the system faster than the old ones disappeared. Anderson, Brenner, Walsh. None of them had official onboarding listed, yet they appeared in access logs, file permissions, and resource allocations. Ghost employees with real power. It felt like a silent coup, executed not in conference rooms but through back-end dashboards and encrypted credentials. Everyone in IT understood the stakes. There were no non-disclosure agreements, but none were needed. Speaking out meant becoming the next ghost. It was an unspoken rule, a quiet agreement born out of shared fear. On Thursday morning, Thomas logged into his admin panel and noticed something that made his stomach turn. His own profile, usually marked as active, had been changed. The status now read, pending review. He hadn't received a call, hadn't been summoned to HR, but he knew what it meant. The system always spoke first, and it never lied. There was no more time to wait. Thomas didn't start digging for revenge. He wanted clarity. After nearly 2 decades shaping the system's architecture, it was more than just code to him. It was a map of the company's soul. Every shell script, API integration, and data pipeline carried his imprint. He knew where the logs lived, how permissions were layered, and which directories most never knew existed. When the system whispered, he listened. The trail began in a secluded folder deep in the operations directory, masked behind nondescript file names and routine batch job references. There he uncovered documents tied to Lance Hope. They were internal proposals, written in a glossy, hollow language that executives loved. They spoke of talent recalibration, operational streamlining, and dynamic synergistic acceleration. Beneath the buzzwords, the implications were chillingly direct. A structured plan to eliminate long-tenured employees under the guise of cultural modernization. But the most damning evidence lay in the financial logs. Thomas traced XML audit trails and back-end exports that had never been meant for internal review. Budgets earmarked for R&D were being quietly rerouted. Over the past 8 months, substantial sums had been funneled to vendors registered in Delaware, obscure LLCs with vague service descriptions. None of them were familiar. None had ever interacted with the IT department. He extracted transaction timestamps, matched them with the company's employee offboarding logs, and found a perfect overlap. Every major layoff preceded a new wave of payments to these shell contractors. It wasn't just a cost-saving measure. It was a coordinated purge. The layoffs were a cover story. People were being silenced before they could notice the gaps in the budget, before they could ask why research tools were going offline or why the new analytics suite never materialized. Thomas knew he was now seeing something he was never meant to find. He saved the logs. He backed up the files. Every fragment he uncovered painted a larger picture, not of incompetence, but of precision. It was theft disguised as transformation, sanctioned from the top, executed through systems he had once believed were built to protect the company. The servers weren't just machines, they were witnesses, and now they held proof. On Friday afternoon, Thomas was called into human resources. The room was sterile, emptied of any pretense of empathy. Lance Hope wasn't there. Instead, a junior HR representative handed him a printed memo. It contained a single unmistakable word: restructuring. No apology, no explanation, no chance to speak. It was already done. His access badge was deactivated before he reached the lobby. He didn't feel anger. He felt precision, a cold, clean break, the kind of calculated exit designed by someone who understood systems and how to erase people from them. He stepped outside into the late autumn sun, the air crisp, the sidewalks damp from morning rain. The parking lot felt unfamiliar now, like a place that belonged to someone else. But clarity sharpened inside him with every step. His termination wasn't a defeat, it was confirmation. Everything he had uncovered on the doctored budgets, the shadow payments, the manipulated offboarding, was real, and now he was free to act. He had already copied the evidence: redundant drives, encrypted backups, secure cloud links sent to aliases no one in Centrion Dynamics could trace. He hadn't rushed. He had prepared for the moment without knowing it, not for revenge, but for responsibility. His son was in law school, thoughtful and relentless, mentored by professors who knew the legal system from the inside. One of them had once prosecuted white-collar crime at the federal level. There were no promises, but there were pathways. He also remembered an old friend from college who had become an investigative journalist. Years ago, that friend had broken a story on insurance fraud that led to resignations and subpoenas. He wasn't part of a national network, but his stories traveled, passed hand to hand, screen to screen, until the truth couldn't be ignored. These people weren't weapons. They were resources, and Thomas had always known how to work with resources. That had been his job, after all: understanding systems, maximizing what others overlooked, finding leverage where others saw dead ends. They had taken his title, but not his knowledge, not his discipline, and not his reach. Thomas moved in silence. There was no need for spectacle, no thrill in vengeance. He packaged the evidence under layers of encryption, labeled it as an internal leak, and sent it to the investigative journalist he once knew. now working in a regional publication with national reach through syndication. The files contained more than financial anomalies. There were screenshots of internal messages, time-stamped audit trails, system logs with IP addresses, and auto-generated reports bearing digital signatures and department seals. He didn't attach a letter. He didn't explain his motives. He didn't include his name. The information spoke for itself. After that, he compiled 2 additional versions of the same data, slightly altered to track if they would be forwarded or buried, and sent them to the IRS and the Securities and Exchange Commission. No accusations, no dramatic whistleblower statements, just structured evidence and a note that read, "For internal review." Then he powered down his phone. Not just silenced it, shut it off entirely, pulled the battery and placed it in a drawer. He returned to small habits, walking in the park, brewing coffee at sunrise, watching the squirrels in the oak trees outside his kitchen window. He waited not for recognition, but for movement. A week later, his son forwarded him a news article. The headline read, "Centrion Dynamics Corporate Bubble? Internal leak suggests financial irregularities." It was speculative, cautious, but it signaled ignition. By the end of the month, the company's stock dropped 12%. Not catastrophic, but enough to shake confidence. Lance Hope's face vanished from the corporate site. No announcement. Just gone. 2 months in, a subcontractor linked to one of the anonymous Delaware entities was arrested in a quiet morning raid. The story escalated. Federal investigators picked up the trail. The case moved from whispers to official inquiries. Journalists began cross-referencing the company's annual reports. Financial analysts flagged discrepancies that once passed as growth metrics. The dominoes were falling. Thomas didn't gloat. He simply noted the dates in a notebook, logged the chain of events. It wasn't revenge, it was accountability, and it had only just begun. Thomas never returned to the company. He hadn't planned to. What he reclaimed wasn't a title or a desk or a line on a corporate chart. It was a sense of gravity within himself. The 19 years he had given to Centrion Dynamics were not erased by a single paper labeled restructuring. He had refused to be turned into a footnote in someone else's strategic narrative. Messages began to arrive. Former colleagues reached out, not just out of gratitude, but with recognition. Some had landed new positions, better ones. Others had taken time to rediscover what they actually wanted beyond spreadsheets and server rooms. They thanked him for seeing what no one else dared to name. He read each note, not for validation, but as quiet proof that the silence had been worth breaking. He moved out of the city and bought a modest house by a lake, not to escape, but to begin again. The house was old, weathered, but solid. In the mornings, he would sit by the window with black coffee, watching light climb over the water. He started rebuilding electronics in the basement, sketching out circuit boards, reworking old systems. Not for any purpose but his own. Not because someone expected him to, but because he could. The hum of cooling fans replaced the clatter of meetings. The code he wrote now was clean, elegant, unnecessary. He reconnected with a rhythm of thought that had nothing to do with company policies or compliance charts. He had no need to explain what he'd done or why. What mattered was that when the moment came, he had acted, without noise, without asking permission, and if he ever felt that familiar shift again, that cold pressure of lies moving just behind him, he would not be surprised. He would not hesitate. He knew now how to speak to power, quietly, precisely, and without fear.